Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth in this monthly series of IATM webinars. This one we're looking at how you begin to prepare for reopening, and we're looking at three key issues to do with that. Next month, we're looking at the digital delivery of museum education with colleagues from Berlin and from Kids in Museums in London. And then in June, we're doing some kind of event from behind the scenes at the German Railway Museum in Nuremberg. And then we'll have a break for the summer and return in September. Today we're looking at three topics which are going to be crucial for reopening our museums into the new world, whenever that might be. And I know for some of you, it looks a little way off. For those of us in London, we're looking at May the 17th to reopen. Let's hope we stay open this time. We're looking at what our customers are feeling about returning to our museums. We're looking at the workplace, how we'll work, how our colleagues, our staff are thinking about returning to the workplace in the near future. And we're also looking at city centres, because we know that our city centres have seen a huge upheaval during the epidemic, and we're going to have a think about what the short or the long-term results of that might be. So joining us today, my co-host is Laura Wright, who's the director of the Postal Museum in London. And then we have three presentations. A big welcome to Steve Mills from Decision House. Steve specializes in customer research, and he's been undertaking regular waves of research through the lockdown to understand what our customers are thinking about visiting museums and attractions. And it's been very interesting to track how that's changed over time. And we certainly found it invaluable in 2020 as we prepared to reopen last August. And at the moment, we're looking hard at what Steve's got to tell us about how our visitors will feel and what will be important to them as we reopen. So we're really looking forward to having the latest from Steve. And then my colleague Claire Cheriyan works for Transport for London. She's a city planner, and in particular on her plate at the moment is how the hard-hit centre of London is to be revived, how it might be changed in that process of recovery, and of course the key role that cultural attractions like the London Transport Museum, my museum, have in driving a process of recovery and change in city centres. And then we are going to be joined, I'm reliably informed, at 2:30 by Philip Ross, who's an old friend and who's a founder and chief executive of the Group, which has been specialising in kind of alternative ways of working, approaches to the workplace for the last 10 or 15 years. He's an author, an advisor, a commentator, and a bit of a futurist on the world of work. And of course, his experience and his expertise is now really having its moment in the sun as we try and plan our way back again. So we are going to ask you to stay muted unless we call on you to turn one of your chat questions into a verbal question, or Laura can pick questions from the chat bar. We'll pause between each contribution, so you can ask Steve or Claire or Philip particular questions, and then we'll move into discussion at the end and finish within the hour and a half. So I hope that will work for you, and we'll be sending the link onto our IATM website afterwards, so that you can share this with other people or with your colleagues. So it's a great pleasure to ask Steve to start us off this afternoon. I think although all three presentations this afternoon are in effect from a UK perspective, I believe that they are very generally applicable, and these are issues which we're all got very much in our sights at the moment. So Steve, what are our customers thinking about a return to museums and attractions in the UK?
Thanks, Sam. I will show you. I'll share my screen, so I have a short presentation. Great, thank you. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So, as Sam said, since April 2020, so this time last year, we've been doing regular waves of sentiment research among the public across the UK on behalf of ALVA, so the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, so the organisation that represents large visitor attractions in the UK. And the aim of that has really been to provide insights which will help attractions understand what the hopes and fears of potential visitors are, so that attractions can understand what's required to build trust and build confidence in advance of reopening, whenever that might be. And attractions have been using this to really decide how to physically present themselves on reopening. So looking at things like what safety measures the public would like to see in place, and what facilities, so things like cafes, toilets, interactives, etc., that potential visitors are feeling most anxious about when they return. And also they've been using it to inform communications messaging, whether that's in advance of visits or whether that's on site, and again to help attractions to build confidence among the public. So what I'm going to summarise today is the latest wave of research. I say latest, it's work that was done, as you can see here, between the 3rd and 9th of March, so almost a couple of months ago now, actually. We've just finished another wave at the end of April that we haven't quite processed yet. So this is really, back at the start of March. And at this point in the UK, we were still very much in a lockdown situation. So the situation at this point was that there were outdoor attractions weren't yet able to open fully. There were some gardens, for example, that were open for exercise only, but the main outdoor attractions weren't allowed to open until the 12th of April. And also indoor attractions obviously weren't open either, so they were allowed to open on the 17th of May in the UK. So we were still very much in lockdown at this point. And in terms of the vaccinations at this point, about 22 million adults have been vaccinated in the UK at this point. So around about 40% of the adult population. So I guess what I'm going to go through today gives you an idea of where public sentiment was given that background context. And actually many of you are in a similar situation to what I'm going to present today. So I'm not actually going to blast you with loads of data and charts today. I just want to talk through some of the major findings that have come out of it. So just to set the scene, really, we did a wave before March at the end of January, so about a month before then. And at that point, at the end of January in the UK, again, we were seeing a very strong rise in infection rates. We had just had another lockdown announced that was going to last at least 2.5 months. So the feeling was quite negative at this point. So actually 40% of the public actually felt less positive about the prospect of returning to attractions than they did in the first lockdown back in spring 2020. And only 18% felt more positive than in the first lockdown. So, and there'd also been this growth in a segment who said, I'm not going to visit for a long time. So there was, back at the end of January, there was some really quite entrenched negativity in terms of coming back to attractions. But in that February period, between the first wave and the second wave, so just in 1 month, there was a really strong, notable positive shift in confidence around visiting attractions when they were planned to reopen. So the proportion who said they'll visit as soon as the opportunity arises actually rose in March to a point that was actually higher than it was back in July 2020, when indoor attractions in the UK began to open last time. So there was a phenomenal change in February this year in terms of shifting positive confidence growth. And that was also at a time when there was a reopening roadmap produced by the government, which set out dates for reopening. So to get that growth in confidence at that time was very impressive, given that when that reopening roadmap was announced back in May 2020, that lockdown easing announcement actually saw confidence dropping at that point, because it all became suddenly very real about a return to visiting attractions back in spring 2020, and that made people feel more reticent again about revisiting. So this huge growth in confidence is incredibly impressive this time around. And the other main point to note here is that the increase in confidence during that February period was driven by those who had been lower on confidence throughout the pandemic, so particularly older people. And unfortunately, by older people here, we're talking about anyone who's age 40 plus, I'm afraid. That's when confidence really tends to drop off. So although confidence is still higher among younger people, it's growing much more rapidly among older generations who are sort of 40 plus. And they were the ones who've been most fearful before. So that's really encouraging to see those groups growing in confidence quite quickly. I think it's also very worth saying that the confidence has been able to grow so quickly in the UK during that February period because of the positive and the safe visit experiences that people had experienced at attractions back in 2020. So in visitor research that we've done during 2020, when attractions were allowed to reopen during the summer and autumn, we saw very high ratings for safety measures. And in particular, we saw some great comments and ratings around the welcome that staff were able to give to visitors. So attractions made visitors feel that they cared about them, essentially. And that's really helped to lay the foundations for this growth in confidence that we're seeing in 2021, now that that anxiety really appears to be easing. So why is it really that this anxiety has eased so rapidly during February 21? Well, I mean, I guess it's quite obvious really, but it's driven primarily by less concern around new variants and high infection rates. Plus, really importantly, it's all around the perceived success around the vaccine rollout. So just to give a few numbers behind that. So when we're talking about variants and high infection rates, back at the end of January, we had 29% of the public spontaneously mentioning something around fear of the virus as being a real concern about going back to attractions. By the beginning of March, that had halved down to 14%. And in particular, 13% back in January mentioned something specifically about more variants or higher infection rates, whereas that dropped down to just 4% by the time early March came. So it's really driven by that perception of infection rates, but also, as I said, around success of this vaccine rollout. So again, back in January, only 5% spontaneously mentioned something about the vaccine rollout as a reason why they'd begun to feel more positive. That had, again, more than doubled to 11% at the beginning of March. And the very recent piece of work that we've just done in April has seen that jump a little bit further again to, I think it was 12%. So again, people can say anything they like at this question at all, and over 1 in 10 spontaneously mentioned something about the vaccine rollout. And I think as well, that recent positive impact of the vaccination programme on public confidence has been really particularly noteworthy. So having the first vaccine dose increases the proportion who said they will visit any attraction as soon as the opportunity arises, up from 47% of the population up to 57% of the population. So a big jump of 10%. So that's how we've kind of measured that vaccine impact. And that compares with an uplift of only 4% that we saw at the end of January. So the vaccine rollout's really having a strong positive impact on visit confidence. I just wanted to read out one spontaneous comment by a member of the public that relates to this. So someone saying, "I'm still worried, and I will be until I get my vaccine. I'm looking forward to the chance to go out, but I feel it should be controlled. I think spontaneity will not be possible, and I think you will need to book for visits to control numbers." So we're very much in a situation, and certainly in the UK, where there's lots of positivity and confidence about returning because of the vaccine, because of declining infection rates, but there is still this quite strong note of caution. So it's definitely a proceed with caution type scenario that we're getting here. And I think also vaccines are having a strong positive impact on visit confidence across all age groups, so both young and old. Although in the UK, actually, the impact is lower in the Midlands and the North of England regions than it is in London and the south of England. So the uplift that the vaccine has is a little bit lower in the Midlands and North of England. And that's really widened the confidence gap that already existed between London and the south and further north in the UK. So the barriers were always stronger to visiting attractions in the north, perhaps less trust around what's going on. And you made, I guess that's just something to flag to say that in your own areas, in your own countries, you may see some regional differences being flagged up in terms of returning confidence. Also, the impact of the vaccine is even more effective in encouraging the very most fearful of the population to at least consider a visit. So in the March wave, we saw 21% saying that they wouldn't visit any attraction for a long time without the vaccine, and that fell to just 8% when these same people were asked to assume that they had the vaccine. So it's really bringing these fearful people back into the consideration set. So attractions aren't yet seeing the visitor numbers coming back through the door in the same way. I think the vast majority of the population are sitting and waiting for a little bit, see what happens, and then they will very likely come back in greater numbers during the summer once they've seen that the visit is safe and secure. So again, another big message to attractions is you have to have measures in place. We can't have any negative publicity. I think since the end of January, so again during that February period, there's been a really significant drop in the proportion of the market who feel more anxious than usual about using indoor attractions facilities after reopening. So anxiety is now actually lower than in 2020. I've just got one chart to show on this one. So what we ask here is which of these will you feel more anxious or uncomfortable about using than usual at attractions? So what we can see here is that actually, arguably, some of these are still quite high. So, for example, 45% of the population of the public would feel more anxious or uncomfortable about using interactive exhibits that visitors touch. 42% are still anxious about using toilets. 40% still anxious about attending indoor events, for example. So some of these indoor activities, anxiety will still be quite high when visitors go back. Although, as you can see on the right-hand side, that anxiety is dropping fairly quickly compared with even at the end of January. So that's encouraging. And as we can see down here, actually outdoors is completely different. Confidence is so much higher in using facilities and outdoor attractions. So outdoor events, cafes or restaurants without outside seating, very low levels of anxiety about using those outdoor facilities now. Back to the key points again. So again, most safety measures that are in place, even now, will still be highly comforting to visitors. Although with that visit confidence growing, the impact perhaps of those safety measures on the visit decision is diminishing a little bit. And it's worth pointing out as well that there's now a small minority of the public who've said, actually, I'm not going to bother going back again to visit until a normal experience can be delivered. So we're beginning to see a few more comments, such as this one that I'll also read out to you, which is somebody saying, my worry is that these places will ruin the experience by having COVID measures in place. I don't want any of them. Things should return to normality. Now, I should stress that these comments are still very much in the minority, but they are beginning to grow a little bit over time. And in this current April wave, we've added a question that I haven't had a chance to have a look at the results yet, which is saying, what would you do if we completely removed all the safety measures? Would you still visit or not? So it'll be interesting to see what comes up on that one. And again, I've got a quick chart on this one. This is one of the standard charts that we show here. And this is the question which says, which of these measures would make you feel more comfortable about visiting? So would they make you feel more comfortable, in dark green, a little more comfortable? Would it make no difference, or would it make you feel less comfortable? And still, so what you can see here again then is that, as we said, most of these safety measures will be highly comforting to visitors still. Though I guess if you ask somebody if they want something that makes them feel more comfortable, they'll tend to say yes. So that we need to bear that in mind. But I think the fact that lots of people are saying much more comfortable for lots of these areas is quite a salient point. It is dropping slightly, so the proportions feeling these measures make them feel much more comfortable is generally falling, as you can see on the right-hand side, as that confidence grows, but they're not really falling that rapidly, to be honest. And you can see that here, actually. So as time has progressed, the positive impact of safety measures on visitor anxiety has gradually reduced over time, as we can see here, with the notable exception of face coverings. So an example here is in light blue is hand sanitizer. So in terms of hand sanitizer, the proportion saying that makes me feel much more comfortable about visiting has dropped from 45% down to 34%. So it's still quite high, but it's dropped fairly significantly in the past few months. Whereas up here, we've got the measures to do with distancing and capacity. So in black here, we've got having distancing measures around the site, and in grey, we've got measures to limit visitors. So things like compulsory online booking, for example. And although those have fallen slightly, they're still almost as high in terms of the effectiveness of making people feel more comfortable than they were right at the start of the pandemic. So the distancing measures have dropped much more slowly. And we've said right from the start that it's the distancing measures that are really the key driver as in terms of how comfortable somebody feels at a site. So they are the measures that are most important to retain if we want to keep the confidence of our visitors. And as we said here, it's incredible how the impact of masks and face covering has changed over the past year. So back in May last year, only 23% said that face coverings would make people feel much more comfortable. By the time we reached January, it was up to the kind of 40% level. Although with that growing confidence, even that has dropped off a little bit in the past month or so. So I think the summary of that really is that we're still some way off being able to completely remove all safety measures without really severely denting visit confidence, especially the measures to do with distancing and visitor capacity, unfortunately, at the moment. But perhaps their impact on the visit decision is perhaps diminishing a little bit. And the very final thing to mention is about public transport. So there's been a very strong increase in confidence around the use of public transport to visit attractions. Again, just between the end of January and the beginning of March, we saw some real strong changes. So again, back in January, we had 44% of people who would usually use public transport to get to visitor attractions saying, actually, right now, I wouldn't use public transport to go to visitor attractions. So that dropped from 46% in January down to 33% at the beginning of March for the underground or metro. For public buses, it dropped from 38% down to 28%. And for trains, overground trains, proportion that wouldn't use it dropped from 34% down to 24%. So a really strong increase in confidence around using public transport, to the state where now we've got around about 75% of the old market saying that they would use public transport again. So I think that was just about it. Yes, it is. So I'll stop sharing and hand back over to Sam.
Thank you, Steve. That's it's fascinating to see a very similar picture to what you were saying a similar time last year. But of course, vaccine has made a huge difference to that, at least as far as the UK is concerned. Just welcome to Philip. Nice to see you, Philip. Great.
And you, Sam. Long time. Good to see you.
Indeed. Yeah, we'll come to you later. Any particular questions for Steve before we move on to city centres? I can't see any hands or other frantic signalling. Laura, have you got a question?
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah.
One is this. Just to be clear, this the questioning is about British visitors visiting British attractions, and their confidence levels have gone up markedly with vaccines. I'm just wondering if you can get any extrapolation from that to think about tourism between countries or overseas. Do you think people are going to be making decisions based on vaccine rollout for foreign travel, or is it impossible to tell from your surveys?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. There are actually, I think, Visit England is doing quite a lot of work on that at the moment in terms of the impact of vaccines. But I think it has to. I think it has to. I mean, you obviously then, when you're talking about international travel, you're talking about looking at vaccine rollouts between two separate countries, when you're coming from and when you're going to, and also the journey back into your own country at the end of it as well. This is a consideration. So it's a little bit more complex than just a kind of one-off trip to an attraction. But I think we can definitely make some positive assumptions about overseas travel, definitely on the back of this.
Thank you. And the other question I had, which I suppose is quite personal, if you're working in a venue which is quite small and tight, do you think visitors to our sector would be comfortable seeing social distancing measures in place forever? You know, they've kind of got used to to going to a place and having a lot of space.
Okay, I mean, one thing I can definitely say about that is, again, I was looking this morning at the very most recent results from April, and there is actually a growing segment that is concerned about anything to do with being in close proximity to anybody and crowds. So this fear of crowds, it's been going on so long now that it's become ingrained in some people's psyche, unfortunately. So I think for those people, it will take them a long time. And if you ask them now, would you like to see this forever? They probably say yes. But I would say at the moment, certainly they're in the minority. But the longer it goes, the more that segment's going to grow, just because people have become less and less used to mixing with each other. But I think the vast majority of people now, confidence again has taken another jump in April in terms of wanting to get back out there again. And many people are now happy to mix. And again, it's all driven by the vaccine, but also, as we saw there, the decline in infection rates is clearly hugely important. So people have now got used to watching the news every night and looking at infection rates and making their own judgment about whether it's safe or not. So people will still very much be looking at that sort of thing. But no, I don't think people want this forever. We're not that afraid yet.
Certainly, Steve.
A while for that to roll out, isn't it? For us to get used to it again. Thanks.
We ought to move on, but certainly I know in TfL's own research that people, once they've been out once, are much more inclined to use public transport, there afterwards. And I wonder whether that will apply to our museums as well. Having braved it once, you're probably more inclined to go the second and the third time.
Yeah, can I just one comment on that? And again, that really reinforces how important it is for attractions to get it right and make people feel safe and welcoming when they go back for that first time.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, thanks, Steve. It's really great. I know there's a huge amount distilled into that 20-minute presentation. So thanks for that. And we'll maybe have some discussion further at the end. So Claire, can we move on? Let's move on to you. We're all kind of quite interested. A lot of us are situated in city centres. We're all interested to know what you think is going to happen to those city centres and what our role in reviving them should be. So Claire, you're sharing, and over to you.
Yeah, I just thought I'd start the sharing since it seems to take me a little while. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And so as Sam said, I work in Transport for London. I'm in the kind of city planning area there. So we deal with lots in kind of long-term transport strategy, forecasting travel demand, Met's transport strategy, the kind of vision for London. And so obviously, like so many other areas, the pandemic has kind of presented a challenge in that work. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we've done, specifically what it kind of means for central London and maybe other urban centres, but also kind of what that means for the coming months and years through recovery. So I think the first thing to say is obviously there is still so much uncertainty. This slide was originally titled "No one really knows," but I thought I would tone it down slightly. And even though we have vaccines coming, we have roadmaps for recovery and this kind of thing, there's still a lot that is unclear there. And you have headlines coming out very regularly within London about how companies who may reside within the same industry have very different plans for the return to the office. Some saying they want everyone back in as soon as possible, others saying they're going to be much more open, people can just do what they want. You have a lot of debate as well about the kind of extent of economic boom during the kind of lifting of restrictions, and also just in the longer term, what does it mean for our kind of fiscal policies and like long-term debt management in the country? And so, we are still very much working with this picture of uncertainty, very much like we were when this first hit. I think though, however, there is a strong case to say that things are going to be different to some extent. So even before the pandemic, we saw kind of challenges to long-term trends. You'd had about a decade of office space per worker kind of reducing. But there were kind of challenges being presented to that sort of like pack them in model, because a lot of new developments were embracing these kind of larger mixed use campus style developments that were trying to create more experience around the workplace rather than just it being a place for you to sit and sit at your computer. And there is probably something about that accelerating as a result of the pandemic. And we see that when businesses are surveyed, so this was back last year when people were anticipating a kind of return to work, a wider return to work in the autumn, quite a lot of businesses anticipating maybe needing less space because people would be working from home more. And we've seen more recently, it was a Open University and others kind of conducted a kind of survey, 97% of all office workers want to maintain some form of work from home mode when they go back, so that's not all the time working from home. I think it was about 80% saying they'd wanted a kind of 50-50 balance. And it's pretty safe to say that whilst there is a huge amount of uncertainty about exactly what we're heading into, some change is likely to happen in our centres. So given this wide kind of range of possibilities, we still needed to be able to plan. We needed to be able to plan for the future, but also plan for recovery, and know that the measures that we were going to be putting in place during the recovery were beneficial over a longer time horizon. So to try and cope with this uncertainty in TfL and others in London, GLA have done this, we've used scenario planning to try and help identify those short-term actions that are resilient to the uncertainty we face. So essentially, what are the things that we can do now that are going to be beneficial regardless of where we end up in the next 5 to 10 years? And this is about, gives us a framework to make good kind of value for money judgments, but it also helps us avoid a kind of paralysis caused by the uncertainty that we face. So within the London context, we developed 5 scenarios. I'll talk a little bit more about them on the next slide. We were interested ultimately in how travel demand and the spatial distribution of travel might change, but they are trying to kind of encapsulate broader changes within the city. Greater London Authority, last year they commissioned it, it was published earlier this year, did a piece of work looking specifically at the central activity zone of London. And that also had an element of scenario planning within it, 3 scenarios in theirs, based a little bit off of some of ours. And so the following slides are just kind of drawing on insights from these various scenario planning and recovery strategy things that have come out of London recently. So I'll tell you a little bit about kind of our 5 scenarios, just to give you a flavour. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. So they are looking at the kind of 2030 time horizon. First one, a return to business as usual, kind of does what it says on the tin. It's kind of things very much going back to where they were, obviously with some shock still economically, but in terms of behaviours and preferences, people broadly are going back to the way things were. London Fends for Itself is a kind of a story of a smaller London and a less kind of globally influential London. So it's meant to be a kind of compounding effects of, say, Brexit plus the pandemic plus poor outcomes for London within the UK context. And it's really the one that's kind of down the end of our scenarios in terms of the kind of optimism scale. Low carbon localism is about seizing the opportunity of the more local activity we've seen during the pandemic, and also people becoming much more environmentally conscious. And it brings those 2 kind of ideas together that looks at a London where life is more locally based, where people are kind of making lower carbon decisions. Remote Revolution is building off the kind of technology side of the pandemic. So a lot of investment within technology development sectors, a lot more working from home. The idea is that communities do not need to be physically located together. And finally, agglomeration ×3 is really a suggestion that you don't necessarily have to have the continuation of the trends you've seen during the pandemic restrictions. The pandemic could actually be an opportunity for greater agglomeration in your centre and more businesses being attracted into it, perhaps off the back of some home working that's going on, but it really starts to see a kind of a stronger centre. And the main kind of way that we've used this is to, as I've said, look at kind of our resilient opportunities, the challenge they present. But what has been quite clear as we've kind of looked into these is that if you have this rebalancing of activity away from the centre, it creates a bit of a sustainable travel challenge for cities like London. So the percentages on this slide are our kind of estimates of what the sustainable mode share is under each scenario. So that's travel that happens by walking, cycling, public transport. And what you see is the ones where the centre is stronger is where, for London at least, that has this high sustainable mode share. Even in that kind of low carbon localism one, which has this presentation that it would ultimately be leading to a more sustainable outcome, because it's got travel patterns in it that do not lend itself to the existing public transport network, you end up having less trips by rail, and ultimately that is such a strong influence on travel in the city that you end up with that lower level of sustainable travel. And that's been quite interesting to kind of present those challenges. And that's not to say that rebalancing of a city's economy is undesirable, and it's not to say that you can't have sustainable kind of polycentric cities. But if what you have after the pandemic is a bit of a step change that isn't planned and catered for, then you could struggle to see sustainable growth within cities. And off the back of that, what it kind of is saying for a city like London when we think about our recovery is it really brings to light how important the centre of the city is, and how maintaining the attractiveness of that city in recovery is quite crucial if we want to think about this kind of aspect of travel in particular. So when we think about our city centres, you know, local visitors are really key, and they are the ones that we want to be attracting back. So when we look at data from just before the pandemic, the little blobs on the left, they just show how influential Londoners were when it came to just like the bodies in the city centre. Now, obviously, a lot of them are there for work, and obviously tourists spend a lot. But in terms of general footfall, it's coming quite locally, and capturing that local market is really important. The chart on the right is, again, pre-pandemic, and it's looking at people who commute into the centre and at what times of day they're undertaking their kind of shopping and leisure activities. And I suppose the interesting thing to call out here is particularly that evening peak of leisure activity. How might you attract people to come to the centre in the evening if they haven't already been there, if they've not been in the office, if they've been at their home base? Or alternatively, you can think about it, how can you smooth the profile of visitors across the week if people are returning to the office only some of the time? And so, yeah, there's this real strong connection here between people undertaking discretionary activities because they're already in the centre.
Mm.
But it can work the other way around as well. So in a lot of the reports that have come out and in some of our own work, what's really stressed is that if you do want people to come back to the centre, you need to be offering something attractive, something vibrant, and something diverse. And that applies regardless of the scenario that you've ended up in. If you're in a scenario in the longer term, say, which is about a city in decline, you want to create a kind of attractive place for people to come and visit. You might be in a situation where business activity is intensifying. You want to provide the kind of supporting infrastructure around that. Or maybe there's been a change to your city centre and you need to create more of a kind of playground environment in order to keep the centre going. There's lots of reasons why you would want to kind of boost this attractiveness, this vibrancy. This quote was just on the recently published City of London Corporation report about the square mile recovery. And I think it probably captures it quite well. And I think it's probably enhanced more in people's minds, particularly those who have been working from home, that they don't want to just come and return to the office and sit at a desk. The connections to other people are really important. The experiences they will have outside of the office are really important to encouraging them to come back. And that's where the kind of cultural hospitality offer is hugely important. You know, why is it, what is the additional draw that people are coming back for? So what I said earlier about kind of offices already pre-pandemic making that change in what they're offering. I mean, this little graphic on the right is just from Arup. It's just a kind of imagining of future office space, you know, so this isn't just about rows and rows of desks, it's about spaces for collaboration, it's about providing facilities, proper facilities so people can do kind of sport and leisure activities either before or during the day, you know, it's kind of really changing what an office and work experience is and complementing what you'll have within the urban realm outside. Another thing that's come through really clearly is the importance of flexibility. So while uncertainty remains, we need to think about using our spaces flexibly. We've seen from work on transport that our kind of our modes are more resilient to the uncertainty, walking, cycling, and buses, for example. And rail kind of gets left behind a bit. So, you know, for example, it doesn't make sense to be making very large investment decisions about expensive rail infrastructure when you still aren't clear what the shape and scale of growth is going to be over the next decade. Whereas those other modes, it's much more easy to flex them and react and to try things out. And so from a transport perspective, that's a kind of where we've been heading to. But it also matters for space in the broadest sense, this need to be flexible. There are likely to be, building vacancies, so especially around retail, maybe even around office space. And how can you use this space in the meantime to maintain attractive centres? People aren't going to want to come and spend time if there's half the units are empty. And you could use space for functional purposes. So we're seeing kind of people considering how you might use it for freight distribution and kind of trials of new ways of doing micro consolidation. We've seen people discussing the role of kind of permanent change to quality residential dwellings rather than office space. But there's also this space of kind of temporary and pop-up, particularly within hospitality, within cultural uses. And what's the role there of these sectors to kind of, you know, help with the vibrancy, but also use space flexibly. And my final slide is just a little bit of work that we did last year about the kind of rate of return. So, and it was kind of the message essentially is, and Sam was kind of mentioning it earlier, but, you know, return to activity might be slow if people are feeling hesitant, but once people take the leap, perceptions change. We did some work looking at using some transport data on our models to try and understand the kind of rate of return to public transport as perceptions of the pandemic, so the risk or the threat of COVID diminished. And what we saw was that the profile for the centre was a lot less smooth than for inner and outer London. And so the initial efforts to encourage people back might feel like they're yielding lower results, but with the kind of right reassurance and demonstration of the safety of the network, you can start to see that more rapid return. However, it starts to level off at the top, and there's probably about kind of 5%ish that we were saying that would remain harder to convince over the longer term, even when the majority of the population are starting to feel, you know, that kind of that they're ready to get back to activity. We see this playing out in our surveys as well. So people who have already started using the transport system have kind of nearly twice as likely to think that the public transport system is safe and clean than those who haven't. And it really kind of goes to show that if you've done the hard work to make your environment safe, to keep your environment, people will respond to that. And then it kind of over a limited number of trips, it really changes their perceptions. That was my last slide. I think the thing I just wanted to kind of end on is that, yes, there is all of this uncertainty, but what I've found from working from a kind of, I suppose, like a longer term strategy perspective is actually embracing that uncertainty is incredibly beneficial. I think we have been too used in the past to making decisions assuming a kind of fixed trajectory, a fixed way that the world was going to be. And we are forced now to think more broadly about the possibilities, about the challenges we might face, and think about what are the measures that could have the greatest and widest benefit. And I think that can kind of only be a positive thing in the longer term. So I will leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. That's great. I particularly like that rate of return trajectory. That's a really interesting one that we'll have to be playing with at the London Transport Museum. Because we're a little pushed for time, I'm just going to move straight to Philip, I think, if I may. Philip, how does that impact on your view of the way the world of work is going to be going in the short and medium term, do you think?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sam. And Claire, I thought that was a really fascinating insight. So it's interesting, Sam. I think if we rewind the clock, you and I were holding debates about the new world of work a few years ago, and there were the kind of early stages of examples of organizations trying to become more agile. The pandemic has really put that into focus. And I think that there's not a single organization I can think of that's not thinking and reimagining how they're going to work. By and large, what we're seeing, not just in the UK, but globally, is a desire to take the pandemic as a chance to reinvent how work is done. Almost everyone sees the thought that doing nothing is no longer an option. And by reconsidering how work is done, people are reflecting on the fact that they've actually quite enjoyed working from home. The global surveys we've been involved in show that only 7% globally in average organizations want to return to the office as it was before the pandemic, 5 days a week, commuting in and sitting behind a desk. The balance of the 93%, about half want to be predominantly based at home and half want a hybrid existence. And that's broadly what we're seeing. The hybrid existence, the most talked about number is a 2 to 3 day working week in the office. So most people are suggesting they'd come in 2 to 3 days in the surveys. That's the self-prescribed approach. And most corporates are saying the same thing. So most are targeting a 40% reduction in real estate at the current time. And that some of them have gone public, like HSBC and so on. So 40% is the average number of a targeted reduction in real estate. And we're seeing that across all sectors: law, finance, pharmaceutical, you name it. That's not equally distributed. The big question, of course, is when do people come into the office? How do they make that decision? Because it's not about a random choice. It has to be at the same time as others. So there's kind of a clustering and critical mass that has to happen. And of course, most corporates are trying to work out how they avoid the office being dead on Monday and Friday, and everyone wanted to come in kind of Tuesday to Thursday, which is a kind of a big issue. And as part of the return, people, of course, are staggering arrival times, which actually then reflects on some of the work, Sam, and you and I discussed about the idea that commuting as a concept with a peak is dead.
Yeah,
I think is equally interesting. Of course, the office, as you described, Claire, is no longer a container for desks. For example, Ernst & Young, we were doing some stuff with them last week, and they went public to say that today 70% of the workplace is desks, and tomorrow it'll be 30% of their workspace being desks. And that's, I think, reflective of many larger employers in London. So what will that workplace look like? I think the vision you described is right. I mean, it's about purpose. People will come to the office for purpose, and that purpose will be the activities that they can't do effectively at home. And so we have to drive the engagement, the interaction with others, and therefore the office will be much more social, and we'll have an array of different spaces. But we'll also have to see a huge rise in hybrid working, driving digital equality. The idea that actually people who aren't there, who are connecting in via video, need to have a leveling out, an equal experience, which I think is interesting. Yeah. I think the other element for you to think about is it's not just a kind of binary home and office. There are places in between, and we're predicting a massive growth in co-working and third space as part of the new world of work. We're working with a FTSE 100 organization. They had 72 offices in the UK. They're going down to 13 or 14. Yeah. And in between, they want a whole series of places that people can work. So one vision would be the polycentric city. The idea that the central business district as a construct is under threat, and polycentricity with the growth of video and new ways of collaborating, I think will be really interesting. The other element I think people in the press and commentary is missing is that, you know, we think we have to come into an office to collaborate, but the platforms that we're using, like Teams and Zoom, although today they're quite basic, the stuff in the labs is astonishing around how they'll enable collaboration, and possibly better collaboration than actually sitting in a room together. So there's a much more interesting debate about what we're going to do going forward. I think it's not as binary as we're saying that we can't collaborate through these digital media. So I think the office has to work harder. But of course, as you've mentioned, by coming into the city, we need to get more out of that. And I think what's interesting for me is that it's no longer it's a heterogeneous situation, because the research we're seeing, of course, it varies by your situation, it varies by your age, and so on. So the key findings, of course, are the young want to come back to the office and the old want to stay away from the office. It's a very fascinating spectrum. You know, people who are single want to come back into the office. Those that are married don't. I mean, you can see the research being fascinating. And Microsoft has done some really astonishing research globally to kind of look at this in their future of work reports. I think also we're going to find that technology will be a fundamental. As you mentioned, Claire, people will expect a well environment to come back to. And therefore, we think smart cities and smart buildings will be fundamental. You'll want to use an app to know when to come in, when to commute, what time to arrive, have a touchless experience to get into your building, use your mobile phone as your remote control for everything you do to avoid touching things. And also from your phone, see who's in. Because when you've come into the city and come into the building, you want to know who else has come in that day. You can't assume that everyone is there, of course. And so I think the app, the app that we're looking at for many organizations could extend into the city, could extend into TfL and others who can help make those decisions easier for people. And I think that's a very exciting opportunity. And again, see the data that drives confidence that they can come into the city and come to an office and be safe. Part of the fear of coming back is, of course, getting there, and I think that's your domain. But also, when you come into the building, what is the humidity level? Because low humidity makes it easier for viruses to be transmitted. So, what is the air quality like? What is the humidity in my building? Is it a safe place for me to be? I think all of these things are really interesting factors to get right. So, Sam, I'll pause there for a second if there's any thoughts or questions.
Sure, thanks. You've packed an awful lot into that, Philip. Thank you. It chimes with a little, I think we're all looking at this issue, as you say. It's become a universal rather than the kind of interesting, quirky conversation we had 7 or 8 years ago, which I wish we'd been able to, in a position to implement more. There two things I wonder about. There's a mixture in what you said about the kind of short term and the long term, and obviously, just at the moment, we're really keen to, do some kind of short-term experimentation, try things and so forth, as opposed to, what technology might deliver in the long term. But already there's that kind of sense that organizations that want to hang on to talent or want to recruit talent, can't do a Goldman Sachs and just tell everyone, they've got, there's only one way of working around here. They'll lose the talent really fast. How does that strike you?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there was a tweet from one of the top execs at Twitter saying, if your organization's not offering flexible working, we're hiring. I think there'll be a massive battle for talent, we think, as part of this. And there are great benefits, right? We're advising law firms who are equally thinking about this in terms of inclusion. There are certain cohorts that find it difficult, with a classic commute and long hours in an office. And there are all sorts of benefits to a more flexible approach to work. And it's interesting, actually, if you think about what the office is for, it was historically the container for work. We had to get to it because all the data, all the computers, all the files were in that container. Today, we're bypassing the office and going straight to the cloud. So there's a psychology that we think is changing as well, which then has to be driven by the city. I think that's the permeability we need. I think that we should encourage a more permeable approach, so that the workplace is truly mixed with living and working and leisure. Today most property typologies are very discrete. You have retail, you have offices, you have residential. And even if a development's called mixed use, it really isn't mixed use. There's a bit of retail on the ground floor. I think that if we can achieve real permeability, it will be really intriguing. So that as you come into the city, you can do a lot more with your day there, as opposed to the debate that's been happening around using things like gyms more locally than in the city centre.
Mm-hmm. I was on a call yesterday where Thomas Heatherwick described previous office culture as 5 days of being imprisoned in a concrete tower with a with a big atrium and security guards at the door, and it's a very different type of vision that you've been extolling. Are there some other questions that we need to put to Philip or our other panel members? I'm looking at the chat and can't see anything at the moment. Go on, Laura.
May I ask something of Philip? I'm really fascinated by the idea that work can be done from anywhere, but I wonder what implications that has for organisations with visitors. A theatre or a museum or an art gallery are quite different places, aren't they? And I wonder if there's something that's a bit contradictory about building locally, having kind of local places where you live and work, and then expecting people to go and visit a building that perhaps you haven't been into for quite a long time. Have you got some thoughts about that?
I mean, I think it's really interesting, Laurie. The idea of inspiring, I think, is a very important place now. If you look at why we're going to come together, it's about innovation, which has to be stimulated, and curiosity is fundamental to that. And I wonder whether actually, those building typologies, the museums and other places where we enjoy culture which stimulate the senses, could also be part of workplace. This blurring of boundaries, because if you explore the idea of work spheres, and the fact that really what we need to do is open a laptop and connect to Wi-Fi, and in theory we can work. Why not do that in a kind of stimulating environment? It doesn't need to be back into that Thomas Hedowic's, grim prison desk factory. So I think there's a potential role for these buildings to be used for a lot more, and people going there to be both inspired by culture and to be able to work. So whether that's around them being a hosting place for the activities we want to do when we come together, the creative sessions, the thinking, the kind of classic, what they call offsites, but you know what I mean, the kind of getting together, because with a distributed workforce, there is a need to bond and to build culture and to have common purpose. So why do that in a grim vanilla meeting room in a boring office? Why not do that in a stimulating theatre or museum or whatever other space is enabled? And I think there's a blurring. I think that if you could see developments a bit like King's Cross achieved, where they blended together great architecture with offices, retail, residential, and education. I think a lot more could be achieved when you bring a cultural dimension into potential developments, and that again drives greater purpose.
Steve, you've got a question about conferences, I think.
Yeah, Philip, I was just wondering whether you had any views on how conferences might adapt and change in the future. Really, whether you, yeah.
As in what kind of normal?
Well, just for in terms of the format and purpose, really. Yeah.
Oh, gosh, that is the $1 million question. I mean, the kind of expo and conference world, which is a huge part of convening people together, whether it's a medical congress or a commercial exhibition, is a big question mark, of course. I mean, my gut feel is they will happen. As soon as people feel confident being in a room together, they'll happen. They'll always now be hybrid, both physical and virtual, I think, going forwards, because of course the benefits of not traveling and extending the reach of conferences has been, I think, realized. But I think, the big question marks with distributed working are, of course, how you learn. How do you get together and learn? And while I don't know whether you saw, Microsoft had launched a new platform called Viva in the last few weeks, which is their kind of big foray into learning, which will get integrated into Teams. So what's interesting for me is that if you believe that our future will be through Teams or Zoom or the like, they're innovating dramatically. So in Teams, they've actually, I don't know whether you've seen this, they've just launched what they call the virtual commute as a function in a Teams environment. So you click a button and it begins your virtual commute, your kind of slowdown and stuff. So they're trying to replicate the patterns of normal behavior in a digital world. They've also introduced Headspace into Teams, which and a way of giving you breaks between what was back-to-back meetings. So they are much more aware of learning, of well-being, of the patterns of behaviour that gave our mental health the right balance. So all of this is kind of an interesting mix to how we redefine our working week. I'm still a huge believer in cities. I think our challenge is to help reinvent those cities, to drive the purpose to go in, to make it exciting, make people want to go in. And of course, there is a huge need for organisations to have people desiring to come into work for all sorts of reasons.
I mean, we've kind of seen during lockdown how the population has become divided between those that have to go out to work and those who those don't. And I wonder how that kind of equality issue will kind of play out in the future. It's a sort of version of Laura's question, actually, whereas, some of my staff have to go into Covent Garden to open the museum because it is, and it always will be kind of, an aggregation of things in one place. We can distribute things to your office and a few others, but, there's a limit. There's a limit to that. Are we going to end up with a kind of a two-tier workforce, a two-tier population?
I think we've got that already, Sam. I think if you look at the figures, frontline workers, who have had to go in and been more exposed is a realised fact. And those of us who can call ourselves knowledge workers have been able to adapt and use these new tools.
Mm.
Yeah, there's no getting away from that. There is absolutely a separation. And looking at how organisations will structure themselves, there are certain people who have to be in an office and then a whole cohort who don't. But you've mentioned some of the kind of companies who said, look, we want people back in the office. And I think we will get a mixed cultural sort of direction based on the individual organisation. But we'll see, I think, a new normal. I think it'll be a hybrid, but it'll certainly have a massive impact on transport. And the idea that actually transport hubs could be the new workplace, I think could be very interesting to explore. I think you and I discussed this a few years ago, but actually if you look at the nodes on the network and you envision some kind of building a bit like Claire was describing above those nodes, why come into Bank when you could all converge in Clapham Junction or Weybridge or St Albans or wherever it might be. So this is the polycentric idea. I think we could see polycentricity with micro hubs. And those specialist micro hubs, around the Francis Crick Centre, there could be a biotech excellence micro hub. And you could even see people who are, let's say, within Ernst & Young who specialise in biotech saying, I actually want to go to that space to work because I'll be rubbing shoulders against people in that industry rather than the EY office in more London. So I can see those kind of ideas coming through. And one of my visions is the re-emergence of the Guild. These specialist building typologies, a bit like we had in medieval times, but reimagined. One example is the Ministry of Sound. I'm sure some of you know in Elephant and Castle, it's a club and a music brand. They've now opened a big co-work space called the Ministry that attracts people in the music business. And I think we'll see much more of that.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting idea. We've got a question from one of my colleagues, Molly, actually, who's asked, can you say more on your thoughts about the role of cultural institutions in the city post-COVID?
I mean, I think
Claire might be with you too, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, the announcements from the City Corporation yesterday were fascinating about the growth of residential. And I think that there is, a huge potential to make the city much more a livable city and develop the nighttime economy through the reimagining of office space, and there'll be a huge amount of redundant office space as residential. So I think we need to kind of reimagine how people will use cities and drive that. So perhaps, as the City of London indicated, produce low-cost accommodation to drive the cultural imperative. So I think cultural institutions, can be driven by interventions like that. As the kind of creative London was driven perhaps by when Hoxton emerged and others that kind of created that kind of creative drive, they were often driven by low rent, environments that got people energized. So I think we can intervene and do that. I think overall, cultural institutions, need to be closely intertwined with the people who bring populations into the city, so the big employers, and trying to work out a new kind of paradigm as to how they interplay. I'm sure there are no answers yet. I'm sure that everyone around the world is struggling with this, because all aspects of the economy that relies on a population leaving work and enjoying leisure is being questioned. And I think we need to kind of make sure that we're proactive in trying to engineer this. I think the app is an important ingredient potentially, because the idea of the nudge, of the suggestion, actually you could go into work tomorrow, Philip, because the Tate has got an exhibition that's opening that you quite like, and you go, oh, that's a good idea. I'll book tomorrow for work. Sam, why don't you come in as well? And let's then go to the Tate. So I think joining up the dots would be very exciting.
Indeed, yeah. Claire, any thoughts about the importance of culture to the central activity zone?
Sam, do you mind if I jump off? I know I've been able to. I'm sorry, I've had one of those days of craziness, but it's been a real pleasure to meet you all. We have an academy. I'll pop in the website, but all of our knowledge and our research goes into our academy. So if any of this is interesting, pop in there and it's all available. So I'll throw the website in, but really nice to meet you all.
Nice to see you, Philip. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
see you
Sam.
again.
Yeah, so I mean, I think so as part of being part of the welcome back offer, that is kind of we are open for business, it is safe for people to come back here. As part of that drawing, I think, and I guess this is what Philip was saying as well, is I think there is a big part for cultural institutions to kind of fill in the gaps when other industries are suffering. I think so I do think, yes, we're going to see this huge amount of activity over the summer, like people have been stuck and want to get out. I am still concerned that I think there are harder economic times to come, and particularly when kind of immediate government support and intervention is removed. And I think having cultural institutions come into those spaces, so when I was talking about kind of vacant units, helping to kind of create that environment so that there isn't a kind of self-fulfilling decline. Like I think that's really quite crucial, I think. And I think Philip mentioned the Square Mile report that I talked about earlier before. I mean, that's really had to kind of think about itself as like, this is a whole area of central London that is really quiet at the weekends, that they're really, it's had all of its eggs in one basket for a really, really long time. And how do you create that better diversity so that you are more resilient to shocks that will happen in the future? If there are, this has been a very kind of good example of why spaces need to fulfill multiple functions if they are to be resilient against these kind of big shocks.
Any more questions from the rest of the room? Philip has put his contact details in the chat, and the Work Tech Academy, which is his business, philip@unwork.com. If you have any further thoughts or questions for him. I am reminded I really ought to catch up with him more regularly than every 5 or 6 years. That was a sparkling contribution. So let's shall we begin to round this up then? You haven't got any questions, Laura? No. Okay, great. So to our two remaining speakers, if there were two things that you'd really like to see cultural organisations doing to kind of secure their recovery in the near future, what might those two things be? And Steve, I guess inevitably one of yours has got to be that safe, do the kind of whole we are safe, we are clean, we are distanced, we are wearing masks, thing. I'm mindful of Bernard's phrase about, you know, sanitize the museum, but not the experience that you give visitors. Is there anything else that you think we ought to really be giving some attention to?
I think the other major thing, if you are a city centre attraction as well, is trying to play on the situation that you're in at the moment. And actually, you are very different. You're a very different experience now to what you were a year ago in terms of what's around and about around. So if you were in London, it's now a much quieter place. So again, I've said right from the start, one of the key messages is come when it's quiet. It's so much more pleasant when it's quiet in central London. These places are quieter. It's not great for the attractions themselves, but in terms of the visitor experience, again, from the work that we've done, so many people are feeding back that they've had a much better experience because it's quieter. So I think building on that message is really important. And yeah, the cities are different places at the moment. So again, we need to think perhaps wider than just individual attractions. It's trying to sell yourself on the basis that the trip into central London is very different. The atmosphere you will experience is very different. And people want different experiences all the time. So that would be the couple of things, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. Claire, how about you? What's on your shopping list?
So I think obviously transport is set up quite differently in different places. And I think you as an institution can do everything to make people want to come back to you. But if they don't feel like it is safe to get to you by walking, cycling, by public transport, if it's possible to use their car, and cities are okay with that, then by car, then that creates a blockage. And so right from the outset, the kind of messaging on our piece about recovery was that, like, we're ready when people are ready, and also we can't be the reason that people don't start to do things. And so I think that kind of collaboration with transport authorities and transport providers to make sure they are giving you and providing for you the right kind of level of service so that people will be able to come back when they're ready to come back, I think is pretty crucial, actually. And I don't know, that will work in different ways in different places, that integration. Great.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you both very much for contributing your insights this afternoon. I think we'll be revisiting all three of the topics we've glossed across today in various places, if not at IATM, over the coming months. So thanks to Steve and to Claire very much, and to Philip, who dashed off to a board meeting at high speed. Just to remind you that if you want to share this webinar, we'll be issuing a link to a recording as soon as we can and putting it on the website so you can share it around with your colleagues. And the next one of these sessions is on Thursday, the 27th of March, also at 2 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, 3 o'clock Central European Time, when we look at digital learning to homes and schools, and we look at some examples from Berlin with Joachim, who's on today's call, and his colleagues, and from Kids in Museums from the UK. But thank you very much for attending today, and follow us in the future. Thanks very much. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.